Good morning. My name is Anders Broström. I'm the director of the Swedish Entrepreneurship Forum, and it is my honor and my pleasure to welcome you to the 14th Swedish Schumpeter lecture, an event organized by the Swedish Entrepreneurship Forum, where we once a year invite one of the most interesting scholars working in a Schumpeterian tradition to Sweden. Schumpeterian tradition means a scholar who has something interesting to say about the processes of innovation and entrepreneurship and how they connect to each other and to development of society. That tradition has long roots, and we've, in the last few years, we have had the pleasure to host some very interesting speakers, including the 22 speakers, Dan Metcalf, the 23 speaker, Ed Glaser, and the 24 speaker, Javier Miranda, on different topics related to innovation and entrepreneurship in our rapidly changing world. This year, I am very, very happy to, in a brief moment, welcome our 14th speaker, Professor Fiona Murray from MIT Sloan. And she will, after presenting, she also will be joined by two eminent discussants, Professor Chiara Franzoni from the Politecnico di Milano and Dr. Carl Halding from Chief Analyst at Sweden's innovation agency, Vinnova. We're also happy to have this event as part of our engagement in the Swedish Platform for System Innovation, Research and Interaction, also in collaboration with Vinnova. So again, to all of you who are here with me today in Stockholm at the School of Economics at Sveavägen in Stockholm, and all of you who are joining us from all over the world online, please welcome the 14th Swedish Schumpeter lecture speaker, Professor Fiona Murray.
Okay, let me make sure that works. Does that work? Yeah. Oh, hang on. And also let me get myself organized. And simply say, as I say in almost every talk I give, that one of the innovations that continues to be missing in this world is a set of microphones that works for women's clothing. So perhaps if we could inspire somebody to do something, that would be very nice. So, and let me just make sure as well, before I get into sort of full flight, here we go, that my slides are working. So first, just let me say thank you. It's an absolute pleasure to be here. I really, very deeply appreciate it, coming to Stockholm. It's a city that I've been to a few times, but not as often as I should. And particularly coming here to the Stockholm School of Economics, such a sort of extraordinary place with such a storied history, and to be part of a lecture series like this, that as I understand it, kind of combines individuals in the room and online who want to think about where scholarship is taking us, but also the sort of the practical world of how we make sure that we really support innovation and entrepreneurship in our economy. And so just what I wanted to say as sort of a little bit of a preview is that, I've spent my career, at least as an academic, and I didn't quite know how to describe the other part of my career, which I want to say is sort of in the real world, although I find that to be quite a sort of offensive to those of us who are academics, as if we don't live in the real world. But, working with governments, working with the private sector, working with investors, really trying to make sure that we create the conditions for innovation and entrepreneurship to flourish, and trying to study in a very rigorous way what makes that possible, while also recognizing that a lot of what makes that possible is to sort of allow for the serendipity of those sorts of collisions between people with problems and people with sort of solutions. And I've especially been focused on innovation ecosystems as places and communities that really do support those individuals. What I'll talk about is a little bit of my own past work, but I'll do that quite briefly, which is a sort of rather odd mix of qualitative and quantitative work on this sort of topic. But where I'm going to go, particularly talking about this issue of geopolitics, is very much informed by my work both in the UK as an advisor to the British government on science and technology, and working very, very closely with NATO on the creation of something called the NATO Innovation Fund, and being involved in a whole variety of sort of government and private sector efforts. I will say as well that all the insights have been generated really never by me sitting by myself in a room, but rather with lots of colleagues. And so just, most of the work will be work with my colleagues, people like Scott Stern, who many of you know, and Mercedes Delgado, who's at the Copenhagen Business School, and others. So I'm incredibly fortunate to have a very long line of colleagues who are sort of inspiration to this work. And always, I think, we try to hold each other as a scholarly community, right, to account for saying things that are kind of useful, I hope. I wanted to focus on this issue of geopolitics and what I consider to be, I think, a very different geopolitical era, because I think in the past 5 years, or actually more, since about 2018 and 19, I would observe that has been uppermost on the minds of those in policymaking seats, and increasingly is now on the minds of entrepreneurs and innovators. If we wound the clock back a decade, I don't think any of us in our entrepreneurship classes would really have talked about the word, we would never have used the word geopolitics. I just don't think that was in our lexicon. And we certainly wouldn't have said it was something that our entrepreneurs and innovators need to understand, because it might profoundly shape the businesses that they create, the opportunities that they have in front of them. I would argue that today that's very different, and we have to have that conversation. In fact, I was teaching a course on building deep tech ventures this semester at MIT, and I had, 70 MBA students and PhDs in engineering and so on. And because the times have been so turbulent, remember, I'm teaching in the United States, and the class started right after the inauguration of the current US president, that every single class, every week, we had to have what I called a geopolitical snack. We had to spend 20 minutes sort of reflecting on what has been happening, because we just sort of couldn't not do that, to try and put that into context, particularly more international context. Sometimes that's hard to do in the US, and also a context that was very relevant for entrepreneurs. And so that's really sort of what I want to talk about, and to sort of inquire as to how we think this shift is shifting innovation ecosystems, and shifting the ways and the places and the context in which innovation and entrepreneurship is happening, and whether, and what that is likely to mean, and perhaps what scholarship and scholarly questions we ought to be asking about it. So with that, I'm going to take my glasses off. I am in that awkward situation where I neither can, if I do this, I can't see you properly, but if I take them off, I can't read my notes. So, all right. So I think the past half century, right, has brought with it a whole wide range of challenges. Some of those challenges are in obviously things like climate instability and the rising costs of energy dependence, and really the need for a resilient energy economy at the very least. If I move to the right, we've absolutely got issues around pandemic response, health burdens, cost of healthcare, and so on. And in the middle, I'd put something that perhaps hadn't been on our mind until recent years, but I think is hugely important, which is the challenges of war and conflict. Put pressure on infrastructure, whether it's communications or physical infrastructure, on our cyber infrastructure, and is also obviously putting defense front and center. Again, not something that we perhaps talked as much about. The defense sector actually is not well studied by academics, I would argue, and yet it's very important. And I think that we believe today that deep tech is understood to be the solution, particularly when software is not enough. And when I use the word deep tech, I'm mostly just using a sort of slightly more fashionable word for kind of innovations that are based on science and technology at the knowledge frontier. Those sorts of ideas that are generated when we make long-term investments in research and development, and are often things that require atoms, not just bits, right? They require us to engage with and manipulate the physical world, not just the digital world. And with that comes the obvious complexities of technical risk of scale up, the massive, therefore, capital and time associated. And so whether it's sort of advanced manufacturing or advanced materials, energy storage, it could be compute, semiconductors, but it's also life sciences, perhaps the one area, if you like, of deep tech that we've often studied and thought about. And so we know we need these kinds of solutions. I think that is not new. And I did promise a little bit to sort of take a slightly historical perspective. I've always enjoyed doing that. My friends who are economic historians are often those from whom I've learned a tremendous amount. And so this idea that we needed deep tech to solve some of our big problems, I don't think is new, right? I mean, I could wind myself back to the late 18th century and think about the transformation of steam into power, which transformed in turn mining, processing, and so on. I might think about the 19th century and this understanding of chemistry, which is my original discipline, chemical processes, productions, giving us dyes and new materials that gave us the Haber-Bosch process and so on. And I can fast forward to the 20th century and the development of the semiconductor industry. And so this is not new, this idea. None of that is particularly new or novel. And yet I think what is new, right? Or the question is, who is it? Who are the organizations? What is the organizational form around which this is being developed? And I would say that, you know, in the post-World War II period, up to the sort of 1980s, I think there was a basic belief and a basic understanding, which I believe is correct, in something that is well known in Europe, the triple helix, right? And the fact that universities, large industrial corporations, and governments were the three core parties to developing that knowledge frontier, to making those enormously important transformative investments, and then actually turning those things into real products. And so whether that's through, you know, an increase in university R&D funding as the kind of dominant source of new science and quite powerful engines of innovation, whether it was large corporations who effectively ran very significant R&D labs, you know, think of the sort of storied locations like Bell Labs or elsewhere, or whether it was government both as funder, but also actually as the sort of locus of innovation through national labs across a range of different countries. And those were the three key dominant actors. And so whenever any of us studied innovation, we largely studied the interactions that interplay among those three. And Etzkowitz and others, I think, did incredibly important work understanding that. But come the sort of 1980s, we got, I think, the beginning of this shift and a sort of turn that I believe started our kind of change towards really saying, actually, the dominant and increasingly important actors in the innovation economy also included entrepreneurs and risk capital providers. That those three stakeholders were necessary but not sufficient not sufficient to the kind of activities that we thought were important and to solving some of our most important problems. And so as the 2000s sort of appeared, we basically got a real shift, I would argue, towards really recognizing that it was often in the hands of entrepreneurs, amongst others, that we would be able to solve some of these big problems, the challenges that we had. That doesn't to say that that government is not important. And so obviously the sort of, let me call it the Matsukatu kind of view about the entrepreneurial state, I think is extremely important. But the kind of agency of entrepreneurs, and particularly the way in which governments were trying to sort of focus entrepreneurs on the things that mattered, the missions that mattered, I think were quite important. And I would wind the clock back and argue that now, in retrospect, when we look at things like the Human Genome Project, I mean, that feels like a very long time ago now, not only underway in academic research labs, but at the time, controversially, in startups like Solera, we're sort of starting to recognize the fact that there was something about the role of startups that was extremely important in driving the kind of incentive activities. We also saw the rise, and I wrote quite extensively about the rise of prize competitions, which is sort of another method to kind of get people's attention, to focus attention on the missions that matter. And we saw with things like the X Prize and things like SpaceX that we began to actually, those prizes we used, and we ended up getting people like and organizations like SpaceX, DARPA's Autonomous Vehicle Challenge, perhaps one of the first and most famous of those, which itself then led to the creation of a number of, you know, really the whole takeoff of the autonomy sector and lots of the startups, Waymo and others in that space. And then things like Hyperloop. And I like Hyperloop because that is one that is repeatedly won by Europeans, right? The students from TU Munich, you know, which feels like, I think, a very familiar place when I walk around that campus. I've been struck by how many years those students have won and then gone on to do some interesting things. And then perhaps, you know, the sort of startup nation, if you like, as an example at the national scale of the beginnings of saying this is not an isolated phenomena. There is a sort of a collection of organizations and startup ventures and capital starting to be allocated in particular locations to focus on very, very specific sorts of problems and challenges. And so what I think that did is really reinforce what I would think of as this sort of new organizational logic, right, of innovation, and one with innovation ecosystems as the sort of locus of activity. Now, many individuals have written about innovation ecosystems, and some of them are in the room, and people like Marianne up there, who I see, you know, has thought about and really sort of helped us think through some of these things. What I would argue is that, this started in a way as a kind of a discussion about Silicon Valley. And there was a sort of sense that that was sort of very unique and kind of unreplicable. I would argue that, again, from at least around the 2000s, if not before, it was very clear that in Kendall Square in Cambridge, outside the doors of MIT, you also had a burgeoning innovation ecosystem, largely focused on the life sciences and solving major and significant health challenges. But over time, these ecosystems, I would say, spread both beyond, across the United States to a handful of locations, but increasingly across here in Europe. And so whether it is in sort of Oxford or Munich or Copenhagen or Warsaw or here in Stockholm. And the way I would think about these and the way that I think we can usefully understand them is these dense, quite open communities. And open is going to be an important word here because this turn to geopolitics kind of calls that into question, of organizations and individuals who tend to be geographically proximate to one another, who support entrepreneurs, who are building and scaling ventures with a kind of flow of specialized resources into and out of those ventures. And in general, they are places that have become highly specialized because the resources that you need, the talent you need kind of agglomerates. And that specialization, particularly in deep tech, right? Again, if I'm doing software, I can be co-located, and there are some benefits to that. And we saw that in Silicon Valley, although I'd argue that the sort of agglomeration in Silicon Valley was actually initiated really around hardware. But particularly when I'm doing things that are physical, complex, have a lot of tacit knowledge that require highly specialized infrastructure, whether it's a scanning electron microscope or, something like that, then we begin to see places being extremely important. And so my own work on this, with Scott Stern and others, has really been sort of trying to document the core stakeholders in these ecosystems and to really understand the networks of exchange that they have engaged with. And so we have basically developed, and I would call this a heuristic. I think calling it a model is perhaps, a step too far, but a heuristic that sort of takes the triple helix seriously. You see the government, corporate, and university, but really pays attention to the role of entrepreneurs and risk capital. And we think about these stakeholders as these essential individuals who commit resources, time, and engage in collective action to support entrepreneurial teams. And if you want to really know what we think about this, and I've last year, I guess, or 2 years ago now, finished a paper with Jorge Guzman, Scott Stern, and Heidi Williams on these ecosystems. It is 70 pages long in quite small font, so I'm not sure I recommend it to any but the most resilient of you. But it very much is trying to sort of make the case that this is the dominant sort of organizational structure. And a lot of my work in particular has been really thinking about and understanding what are the policy interventions that reduce frictions in the interaction among these individuals and these individual stakeholders. And in particular, how is it that when we want to drive this ecosystem logic, so we get the startups that build solutions to the problems that matter to us, what are the logics that sort of have to be accounted for? How is it that we can sort of cross those boundaries between universities with their sort of academic logic and entrepreneurship with its commercial logic? And so, the kinds of questions that I focused on for a long period of time were really about what I would call these hybrid exchange strategies, these boundaries of overlapping institutions between the academic world and the commercial world. I would argue it's much less controversial than when this work was originally done. I don't have nearly as many conversations with people saying to me, academics shouldn't start companies. But that was, I would suggest, the dominant logic on university campuses, including MIT's, which is quite a forward-leaning institution around this. And so ecosystems have always been about tensions and frictions, trying to sort of focus energy and attention to get some of these outcomes. And so particularly from a policy level, I think we understood that ecosystems were really about a source of economic prosperity. They were places, right, where we could really turn the handle on innovation, and they could actually drive significant amounts of economic prosperity. Regions wanting to do that tended to focus on potential sources of comparative advantage because that was going to allow them to have a foundation of a burgeoning ecosystem. And the government role, I would argue, was really all about funding the foundations, right, continuing to sort of shovel money in and shaping institutional arrangements. There was some direction setting, but I would suggest very, very little. Largely, this was about sort of bottom-up shaping of those arrangements, but certainly around comparative advantage. And through the program that I've co-created with Scott, in the REAP program, we work with about 70 regions around the world, sort of helping them build sort of this logic. Fast forward then to what I would say is the late 2010s. So let's say 2015, something like that. And we begin to see the rise of China as, let's call it, a technology superpower, and the start of geopolitical tensions, particularly in the United States. And again, I'm going to sort of describe this from a US perspective, because if that's where the ecosystem sort of logic starts, it's also the place where geopolitical tensions rose, I think, much earlier than here in Europe. And began to call some of those things into question. You can think of lots of charts and graphs that have to do with the rise of China, particularly in technology, not so much in manufacturing. On the left, you can see the US sort of as a percentage of worldwide R&D expenditures going down, while China is really the one that goes up. You can see the sort of the share of articles of the top 1% most cited. The sort of US stays somewhat flat, goes down a little bit, while China is definitely on the rise. And you can see on the right-hand side that research production, particularly where money is being spent, you can see this huge increase in the US in the health sciences and life science portfolio. And in China, much more around physical sciences. So some very, very interesting dynamics and some brilliant work by various of our colleagues, sort of really trying to sort of Ina Ganguly and others, trying to sort of unpick this with Richard Freeman and so on. But we absolutely see this trend. And in fact, I find it a little bit easier to see it in a slightly more normalized fashion, where if you take the 20 years from 2000, which I've sort of identified as a kind of marker a little bit, for over a 20-year period, China has a 16 times increase in R&D spend, a kind of 20 times increase in publications, a sort of 4-ish times increase in impact, and a 5x increase in STEM PhDs. And so what you observe is the US particularly sort of looking at this and suggesting, maybe we're not the only sort of R&D game in town. And this is something that needs to be reckoned with. Or perhaps it doesn't. And there has been, and was, particularly from sort of 2015 to 2020, I would suggest a kind of ongoing debate about whether, A, this is true. So there's a lot of debate at the time about whether or not most of what was happening in China was either sort of copying people's articles, replicating research, not actually building the foundations of knowledge, whether much of what was happening at the frontier was either copied and so on. But I think by the time you get to 2020, it's very hard to really dispute, I think, some pretty extraordinary innovation and activities. And what I think happened is that nations established surprisingly similar, quote, wish lists of priority technology. So as a result of this, a whole bunch of countries said, hold on a minute, we need to make sure we're good at this so that we don't lose the lead. And the American government came up with what they call their priority technologies. NATO came up with a sort of a logo, which they call EDTs, emerging and disruptive technologies. Again, in the US, critical and emerging technologies. In the UK, we call them priorities. We had a thing called the 8 great technologies. And then they found a couple more. So they said 8 great plus 2. I mean, governments do odd things, in my view, in this regard. I mean, they sort of have these lists. And what's pretty interesting is that all the lists are basically identical. And then if you actually look at China's list, they not only have their own list of what they want to be good at, but they also have a foreign technology wish list of the foreign technologies that they want to understand better. But what I would suggest is that this begins to put sort of technology and technologies, you start to see words like technology superpower. The Brits talked for a little while under Boris Johnson of the word science superpower. So there were lots of interesting language being used, which had never really been used in quite the same way before. Technology superpower, technology as a source of power. and really recognizing that being very, very good at certain sorts of technology was an important part of power, not just in the form of economic prosperity, but in some slightly broader form, but perhaps a little bit unclear what that really meant, but definitely a recognition that it was important. And with that, a sort of view that, okay, well, that means we need to get these ecosystems, and they're the places where this technology is being developed. Let's make sure that we actually sort of supercharge them. You know, again, lots of these interesting words. The language of this is actually quite fascinating. And then really arguing, you know, what are we going to do about this? And how can we make sure that these ecosystems are strong and focused on what is important to a country, which I think is a rather different kind of framing and so on. And then we had the Russian invasion of Ukraine. And I'm not sure that many of you would expect, given those of you who know my work, to suddenly see me deciding to talk to you about tanks and drones. But I actually think it's incredibly important because drones in Ukraine today, as I think most of us know, provide massive comparative advantage to those who can innovate rapidly and produce them at scale. And really, there are many things that we could learn from the invasion of Ukraine and from Ukraine's response. And there have been many reports written. Most of them are actually about the kind of military lessons. I think that there are an enormous number of lessons that we can learn actually about innovation and innovation ecosystems from Ukraine. And so what I then set about doing with some of my colleagues is to really analyze their drone ecosystem and to see whether or not the ecosystem logic was happening in Ukraine, because it certainly seemed as if that was true. And so it really is, I think, what we found, and the report is sort of in the middle here. It's done with my colleague Phil Budden, who I've done lots of ecosystem work with, but also with our student Darina, who is an MBA student, but she's Ukrainian and has spent the prior 5 years actually working with McKinsey in Ukraine and continued to go backwards and forwards. And we worked jointly with the Kyiv School of Economics. It was really important to us, actually, that we didn't just tell this story and try to do this analysis as kind of outsiders admiring the problem, but actually with people on the ground trying to do the work, so that we treated the phenomenon, I think, with respect and kind of respected, you know, the extraordinary lengths that a nation has been going to. It's a little bit being picked up by various, you know, people, but I hope it's an interesting thing to sort of think about. And what did we discover, right? We basically, I think, have discovered what I would consider the first modern innovation ecosystem to being essential, not just to providing technological solutions, but providing them in a conflict. It has some relationship, in a sense, of the galvanizing of an ecosystem to some of what we saw in COVID, with the ecosystem being galvanized around Moderna in the US and BioNTech in Germany. So a different sort of conflict, but definitely I think this has been important. A few things at the core of innovation and entrepreneurship in the ecosystem were amplified by things that sometimes when we tell the story, we argue that it would make our colleague Eric von Hippel, who the academics in the room will know well, this would make Eric very happy in an odd way, because it really is a story of sort of open innovation and many innovators contributing. I think very sad in many ways, of course, because this is a very tragic situation, but lots of access to decision makers and end users, massively decentralized procurement, so individual brigades being able to buy effectively what they need, a huge network of volunteers. And this is the sort of Eric von Hippel piece of this story. So this is not a pure sort of economic ecosystem in its traditional sense, but absolutely with crowding in these network of volunteers, crowdfunding resources. But after about 6 to 9 months, you absolutely started to see this defense and drone ecosystem emerging with all 5 of the stakeholders we think are important playing a part. So absolutely entrepreneurs, really trying to develop drone technologies based on very, very rapid feedback. Risk capital being provided through a pretty extraordinary range of different channels, and I'm happy to talk in more detail later about that, but both venture capital funds being set up on the ground with outside funding, charitable donations, government funding, and so on. So a very sort of interesting set of new forms of risk capital. Very little actually from corporates. There's one well-known Ukrainian defense company called Uberomprom, I think. My Ukrainian is not very good, but who began to really sort of contribute. A government who did a huge amount through rapid scaling of their regulatory simplification, procurement, and so on. And then universities playing a smaller role, but actually that role, as we see today, is being massively increased in terms of training and what have you. So it's a very interesting thing to sort of observe. I'm not going to go through, every single thing. Let me just say a little bit about risk capital, because it's just interesting. The funding for procurement from the government. And this begins to remind us that when we want certain things, one of the best things governments can do, it turns out, in really invigorating and reinvigorating ecosystems is to actually provide a demand signal, is to buy things. And so that was obviously important. They have this program called Army of Drones, but there are also state-backed funds and the Ukrainian Startup Fund. Absolutely volunteering and crowdfunding initiatives. So crowdfunding represented almost 2% of Ukraine's GDP in 2023. Really important. And then angel investors and high net worth individuals. Foreign donor support, a number of ways in which foreign governments, for example, would basically buy Ukrainian produced drones and then give it to the Ukrainians. I mean, there was sort of a whole variety of mechanisms, and then more specialized institutional venture funds. So we see something that, frankly, in our sort of typical ecosystem analysis looks quite similar. Although lacking some of the stronger sort of institutional players at any kind of scale. But I want to just sort of suggest that we also learn something else, which is by the time we get to 2004, Ukraine actually has increased its production capacity of UAVs, of autonomous systems, largely airborne, but some in the sea as well. There's a famous Ukrainian designed and developed drone called Sea Baby, which is the one that blew up the ships in the Black Sea. And you can see they went from effectively producing about 3,000 drones a year in people's basements to somewhere in the region of 4 million a year is the capacity, although they don't have enough money to buy all of those. But the real difficulty, and this was what became very abundantly clear, was that they were caught in sort of trade hostilities between the US and China, and in particular, the supply chain became an issue. And I would argue that, again, this is one of the first times, because of the pace of this, that the nature of the supply chain and production and industrial-based dependency of an ecosystem on an industrial base in another country quite far away in China, and the nature of the geopolitics between China and the US creates a lot of challenges in Ukraine and amongst Ukraine's allies. And so this is what we start to learn from this case. And so I see this both as something that's interesting to help us understand ecosystems themselves, but it's also put them in light to show some of their massive vulnerabilities. And so the work that I've done recently is actually with my colleague Edlyn Levine. And what we decided to do is actually ask the question, so why is this? Was this inevitable? Was it the case that drones were simply, and their supply chains were simply invented in China? And so, of course, all the manufacturing base is in China. We know that DJI is the largest producer of drones, of commercial drones. It's interesting, that company itself was founded in 2005 on the back of its founder winning a business plan competition in the Hong Kong University of Science and Technology. And so again, some of the things that we think of as the absolute stimulants to innovation are just as powerful in this story as well. And so I won't go into this in detail. It came out in Tech Review. So this is not intended to be the most sort of super academic thing I've ever written in my life. But I will tell you that this image on the right is one of the most widely cited of anything I've ever done. So, it tells you something. So here's the question we asked. We said, all right, let's do an anatomy of a drone. We're going to put a drone on an operating table, take it apart and ask the question, what are the key components? There are about 12. Where were they invented? Where are they produced? And so you can see on the right, if we take, so the lines down the middle are those main components. So they range from lithium polymer batteries, brushless motors, antenna and so on, cameras. On the right, you can see the country of manufacture. Almost everything is now manufactured at scale in China. And it's extremely difficult to find scaled, reasonably priced production anywhere else in the world of most of these parts. And so we then trace backwards all of the core underlying ideas, right? The sort of core underlying intellectual property, and ask the question, where were the technology origins? Because as I say, it might have been that this was inevitable because that was where it was all invented. And the answer is, not surprising perhaps, largely invented in the US, Japan, Europe, Russia, and UK. You might ask why I separate out Europe and UK, and you can imagine that my British colleagues get upset if I don't. So they like to have their own bar, even if it's extremely small. So they did work on the control systems and sort of cameras and things like that that you can kind of see from the UK. But this is a story. A lot of those inventions at the time were absolutely what we would think of as deep tech. The invention of some of these battery systems, some of the brushless motors, the neodymium magnets, really important. But this is a story that's unfolded since about 1970, actually, with most of these components increasingly sort of moving offshore. And so what this does is it basically reminds us that this has been driven by a reliance on China as an industrial base, especially at scale. And so this idea that China is this huge percentage of global manufacturing, I think, particularly in these kinds of areas, is extremely important. And what this just sort of puts into sharp relief is something that obviously is much on the news at the moment, but I think is true for the US, but also the rest of the world, which is we effectively have created, I think, without perhaps paying as much attention, a sort of two systems, right? So we've got innovation ecosystems in Europe and the US and elsewhere, completely decoupled really from the industrial base. Obviously, some of our colleagues have thought a lot about manufacturing and continue to do so in semiconductors and elsewhere. But that sort of separation has meant there's a huge economic efficiency in having these innovation ecosystems and not really worrying about where stuff was produced. And I would argue, if you looked at what we told our students, we would tell them as entrepreneurs, minimize your manufacturing costs, right? Most efficient supply chain. I actually have a former student who works with, who actually developed all the production for iRobot, the Roomba, which is that sort of thing that goes around as an automatic vacuum cleaner. He spent 3 years out in Shenzhen developing the industrial base, developing the production out there. And for many years, helped companies do that. It was extremely efficient. So there's one issue around that we've suddenly comes into sharp relief in the Ukraine situation, because if you don't have control over that part of your supply chain, you no longer have strategic control. And the other, I think, that is perhaps less obvious was actually with manufacturing technologies comes tacit knowledge, skilled labor, and a shift to then being able to innovate. Again, not a new idea. Gary Pisano and others wrote about this for a while, but if we now look at things like electric batteries, both competition within China, but also competition with the US means it's not just about production. It's actually, there are innovation ecosystems in China as well, and we ought not to forget that. And my colleague Yashang Huang and I have been thinking quite a lot about that, and he is a deep expert on that topic. And so these are some insights that we get from, I would say, this shift to this sort of geopolitical period. And I would frame that in a slightly broader way, particularly with the shift in the US administration, which is a focus particularly for Europe as a broader need for technology or innovation sovereignty. So it's not simply about arguing that all of a sudden there's a dependency over here on a country that we may or may not want to be dependent upon, but actually particularly with some of the other things happening in the US, whether it be cutting access to Starlink or changing the rules around intelligence sharing, what the sort of war in Ukraine as part of this broader geopolitical shift has done, I think, is sort of make the case for, or at least put on the table, this question of sovereignty. So you see lots of headlines like the one on the right, Europe's dependence on US tech is a critical weakness, and this need to protect sovereignty is a word that we never really used to use in the kind of management lexicon, I would argue, and not really in the economic one either, but it has become, I think, really important. Now, I'm not a political scientist and don't pretend to be one, but I would argue that as we study these innovation ecosystems in this new era, what we're beginning to see is, I'm going to skip over a bit more history, is a wider lesson, which suggests that it's really the innovation ecosystems that we're trying to sort of understand and ask the question, should they too be kind of sovereign in some sense? And what would that actually mean? It's not just that we need specific resources. Of course, we want our critical minerals, and of course, certain firms matter, like TSMC. But actually, we've got to really sort of wrestle with the question of what would happen if we kind of put this sovereign lens over a phenomenon of innovation ecosystems that has always been a phenomenon that is about sort of openness. It is absolutely about concentration and co-location, but it has been done in a way where we argue, where I think most of the dominant network engagement is about collective action, sort of shared collective leadership. So I think that there are three things that we're beginning to see that are quite distinctive. And I've been writing about this with Ronnie Chatterjee, who's one of my MBER colleagues who's at Duke, but who's also spent time in Washington working on the CHIPS Act. I think he's now also the chief economist for OpenAI. So there are three things I think we think are important. The first is a sort of call that we're beginning to hear towards innovation ecosystems directed to provide kind of strategic autonomy in key areas of technology. So this idea that we need to be kind of working on certain things in certain directions. So there's quite a strong focus and a recognition that they might be important, not just for prosperity, but also for national security. And what that does is it sort of says, well, all right, what does that mean we should be focusing on? Let's see whether we can push these ecosystems towards, space technology or other things that we consider to be priorities. A second is to have some sort of sovereign control over the underlying ideas. And I think there's a real argument about what that actually means, but it is being manifest as questions around retaining core intellectual property, controlling who gets to be involved, the ideas, where they go, what happens to products, export controls, a kind of an entirely new legal apparatus. And again, much as I've spent time studying intellectual property, I've now started to look quite carefully at things like CFIUS, which is like a capital controls, ITAR, which are export control rules. So a different set of legal apparatus sort of wrapping its arms around ecosystems. And thirdly, a huge call for these ecosystems to be connected to scaled industrial base, with the word domestic in parentheses, because I think at the moment, particularly in Europe, the question of what domestic means, given that this is not the US and it's not like even the US can't actually do this domestically, but I think it causes each of our countries to try to work out the sort of complicated calculus around who we do this with. How much do we do alone? What does sovereign mean? Is this European? Is it country level? And so I think of a real departure from a sort of gains from trade ethos that underpins most of the innovation ecosystem activity and logic for the last few years. So the last couple of things I just want to say before I close is that we've started to look at this, and I've been working with Jane Wu, one of my former students who's now at UCLA, on how this is beginning to affect quantum computing. And I think she presented a paper that a few of you might have seen at something in California, looking at whether or not, even in the shadow of this sort of narrative and logic, we're beginning to see a shift in the scientific networks that you might think are just sort of immune to this. We don't think that's true. And so we have been looking, and I also work with Lars Froland, my colleague in Denmark, at sort of a few things. And we're really seeing attempts to highlight specific priorities. And quantum is a very good example through quite clear intervention, but a sort of debate at the moment about the scale at which that should happen. And Denmark's a really interesting case of, should that be Denmark? Should it be Denmark? Should it be the Nordics? Is it Nordic quantum? Is it Danish quantum? I mean, how do we actually sort of think about this? A massive emphasis on starting to sort of worry about the control of people into research activities, right? And understand the changing networks and the creation of so-called trusted fabs, so trusted places. And I use the word trusted again, it's another interesting word that people have used, to sort of start to control who is developing production scale activities and that production scale knowledge. And I would suggest that as preliminary observations, that if we think about what's happening, there is some new, so much as in the past, the tensions that I observed in ecosystems around, say, open academia versus the kind of closedness of startups where we were trying to kind of make money and control IP, but there's a new set of tensions that I suspect are probably bigger, would be my contention. But for universities, I think there's a profound tension between a sort of open and economically valuable flow of students and a government desire to control the flow of intellectual property. This is very, very strong on campuses in some of the elite US universities. And it has the tension of that is being added to by the other dimensions of complexity that the universities are facing. But this is basically the question of, are we training foreign students who then steal ideas and take them elsewhere? I mean, that's the basic question mark. And you start to sort of have national security conversations being sort of proposed on campus in ways that I think are quite complex and difficult for the universities to deal with. The second is risk capital providers, and we see this a lot. I've dealt with this a lot in my work with the NATO Innovation Fund. There's a tension between the desire to crowd in capital into the ecosystem, particularly at the early stages, and the loss of intellectual property. So again, through capital access. You know, in the UK, we have something called the National Security Investment Act, trying to deal with this in the US, and the loss of sort of corporate control. So I think that there's a different tension being placed on risk capital providers. And lastly, on entrepreneurs themselves, a tension between exploring global markets of products and for production and the desire of government to serve national, regional, or kind of alliance markets. And so what we see, I think, is that this new era of geopolitics is placing significant and very, very new and different and distinctive tensions on the ecosystem at a time when, for even governments themselves, the calculus of whether it is sort of economic prosperity versus national security and whether there is a trade-off is, I think, yet to be determined. And the locus of what it means to say it's a sovereign innovation ecosystem, which is why I put that sort of idea in quotes, I think is a very live and important kind of question. And so just to summarize, I mean, it seems to me that this new era places sovereign innovation ecosystems across Europe in particular, you know, in the spotlight. And I would argue on the research agenda. And so for me, this is, I think perhaps one of the major questions for me of the next decade is really understanding both how this is working, what the trade-offs are, and how we actually begin to understand the responses of individuals, of organizations, of institutions. And so with that, I will stop. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. The lecture offers a number of insights, challenges how we think about and study innovation entrepreneurship, and also, of course, stimulates further dialogue. Now, to take that dialogue one step further, we have invited two discussants. Mind you, they are invited beforehand, but they heard the lecture at the same time as the rest of us. So with that, our first discussant is Chiara Franzoni, please.
Thank you very much. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Great. So I'm deeply honored to be part of this distinguished lecture, which stands as a tribute to the enduring legacy of Joseph Schumpeter. I thought it was useful to remind it, whose insights into innovation and entrepreneurship continue to shape our understanding of economic and societal prosperity. And his vision of the entrepreneur as a central agent of transformation remains as vital today as it is and it was nearly a century ago. So true to his legacy, it is particularly fitting to honor Professor Fiona Murray, whose distinguished contribution to the open knowledge paradigm, innovation ecosystems, and deep tech entrepreneurship not only advanced the frontier of scholarship, but also informed policy and practice at the highest level. So in the spirit, I thank Anders Brostrom and the local organizers for the kind invitation to comment on today's lecture. And following their guidance, I would like to approach this role as an opportunity to reflect on the changing global scenario that Fiona has just highlighted so vividly, and particularly to focus on what the implications are for the economics of innovation as a discipline. And for the scholars and colleagues who, like me, feel a belonging to this community and to its enduring mission. So the topic of this lecture captures, I think, several key issues that are central to the community of economics of science, and I would like to mention 4 of them. First, I think there is the centrality of science. This is a theme that is very dear to me. So the idea that innovations that introduce new functionalities, improve human conditions, solve problems, can also help you win a war, maybe. And generally, they make more effective use of the resources which are scarce, have over the past century become increasingly and inextricably dependent on science. So as we heard from Professor Murray, if data and computational power were the holy grail of the digital revolution, and they still are, deep tech innovations are rooted in the natural and physical sciences, not in the digital. So the breakthroughs depend really on physical things like material engineering at the molecular scale, photonics, superheat propellants, nuclear fusion, genetic editing, and more. So never before in history has technological progress been so fundamentally anchored in scientific understanding, which forms the backbone of the DICTAP development. So this has repercussions, I think, for both the method and the communities which are involved in this. So the progress in these areas unfolds through a path of trial and errors, which is grounded in the scientific method, where foundational research and experimentations are guided by iterative cycles of testing, observation, retesting, pivoting. So all of this is also strongly scaffolded by the insights, critiques, and collective sense-making of peers. And so science, which is essentially a speculative and curiosity-driven human activity, some would say dissipatory activity, is today one of the most practical and powerful tools that we have to confront contemporary challenge and shape future opportunities. So after all, nothing is more necessary than the unnecessary, it turns out. A second and related key theme emerging from Professor Murray's lecture is the renewed centrality of the physical spaces, which I think it's very important given that we live in a world which is increasingly digitalized. So we feel that membership, something in the air, not in the physical spaces. However, Professor Murray reminded us that the world is also very much physical. So this is evident both at the macro level when she discussed about the geopolitics of the supply chain, but also at the micro level where there's the sense that we need to cultivate co-working spaces, tech hub. I think I've heard the term dorm, tech dorms or something like that, where scientists, entrepreneurs, students, academics form vibrant communities that foster exchange and collaborations, and they do so within walking distance. So the geography and the microgeography of innovation has long been a hallmark of the economics of innovation. And this body of research has challenged the notion that knowledge can be fully transmitted through abstracts or digital means, emphasizing instead the importance of direct human interaction and to free face-to-face exchanges. And this brings me to the third important theme addressed by the lecture, which is that the knowledge regimes in which innovation, and particularly deep tech, is fostered and developed into technical solutions. Well, I guess it's important to stress that this has been a long-standing area of interest for Professor Murray, who has constantly been a strong advocate for openness and accessibility, particularly in cumulative technologies, where knowledge privatization can seriously compromise progress and hinder the emergence of entirely new fields of application. So technological regimes and openness, I think, is the third very important theme of the lecture. And the fourth and final key theme that I would like to emphasize, there might be many more, but this is once again in the Schumpeter's legacy, is the essential tensions that we have heard between cooperation from the one end and competition, and the fact that industrial policies and innovation policies always have to balance this tension, because you need competition and you need cooperation, or you're forced to have competition, but you need cooperation. So let me now build on the four issues raised in this lecture and how I think, and explain how I think they challenge our theoretical frameworks in the economics of innovation moving forward. So the first theme, the centrality of science, implies, I think, that the organization of science is key, not just the funding, but the way in which you organize the scientific endeavor. And one striking insight from her talk is that we have just heard how permeable the boundaries are becoming between the scientific laboratories and the deep tech entrepreneurial companies. And these blurring boundaries challenge long-standing disciplinary divides that place from the one side innovation that was seen as the realm of private companies, profit-driven, and studied by the managerial sciences, and on the other side, the domain of scholars governed by public policy, eventually economics, but more at the macro level rather than the micro level of organizations. So too often the managerial community treats tech labs as somehow outside the scope of management studies, and I think this is just plain wrong. And yet the Slavs, in every meaningful sense, are complex organizations facing significant managerial and organizational challenges and deep tech careers, recruitment, retention of talent, how to characterize progress and performance, particularly because we are dealing with a context in which the performances could only be seen over a very long time horizon. So all of these are themes that should be central in organization and management studies, and I hope to see greater attention moving forward. So similarly, I believe we need more studies that examine how scientific and technical inquiry actually unfolds, moving beyond, I think, a cliché understanding of the scientific method, and instead investigate the collective process of interpretation, framing, and sense-making that arise in this community when there are planned opportunities being developed, but also unanticipated outcomes that are so plentiful in scientific inquiries. And I think this is, again, an area where economics and management of innovation could and should converge more actively in the years ahead. So turning to the reinstated importance of co-location, the third theme, and the sharing culture of science, future research in economics of innovation will need to investigate how ideas flow or fail to flow. This is a theme that have always been investigated. But this idea now is that the frictions of our knowledge exchange in the past, the one in which we focused on, were mostly based on disciplinary language, technical barriers, but today they are also frictions regarding belonging or membership or strategic alliances, especially over geopolitics. So these dynamics present profound challenges for global innovation ecosystems and for science itself, and they call for greater attention to the role of, I would say, even ideology, national boundaries, institutional membership. Fiona discussed also trusted places as a potential source of friction in knowledge creation and diffusion geographically. Finally, I think we need more studies of innovation and competition to guide future industrial policies, and an area of interest here is particularly the cross-national strategic supply chain, whereas in the past the studies focused mostly between the dichotomy of competition, monopoly. Now we have across the supply chain, I think. So let me conclude by warmly thanking Professor Murray for a rich and thought-provoking lecture. Her work continues to challenge us to think more expansively about the forces shaping innovation and to reimagine the framework we use to understand them. And as we reflect on the themes raised today, one question lingers. So in a world where scientific knowledge is both a shared global good and a strategic national asset, how do we design institutions, incentives, and spaces that sustain openness and aim at a prosperity and good of all human beings, even as geopolitical pressures seem to push us towards a more fragmented, securitized model of innovation? Division and competition may seem inevitable in moments of crisis, but much of our greatest progress has been built in times of peace through networks of collaborations, shared knowledge, and trust across borders. And I hope this tension and the questions that it raises will continue to animate our conversations moving forward. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Chiara. So we have our second discussant representing Sweden, perhaps in this case, the Swedish National Innovation Agency, the government's Swedish government's expert agency in issues on innovation policy. Dr. Carl Halding.
No, yeah. Not a doctor, though, but thanks anyway. Thanks a lot, Fiona and Chiara. Very interesting presentations and commentaries. Thanks, Anders, for inviting me to come here and talk to such a distinguished audience on a very important topic. So, as Anders alluded, I will provide something of a Swedish perspective on these very important questions in these changing times, and how are we going to organize and drive prosperous ecosystems in a completely new geopolitical setting. So I made some notes here. I mean, many of the things that you pick up on here, the role of the ecosystem, the progress of ecosystems through history, and how they, in the post-Cold War period, became extremely successful based on open markets and open interaction. And now, since maybe 10 years, but really accentuated with the past 5 years, the world is not like that anymore. So how do we organize that? How do we organize ourselves? So I'd like to compliment on your presentations from a Swedish perspective. We're a country that have long benefited from strong support to research and innovation. So how do we organize ourselves here? I think, first of all, I think it's important to reflect on the argument of openness, that openness have led to prosperous innovation ecosystems. And particularly, we were in Silicon Valley a few months ago, and I started to track back and try to learn a little bit more about how that extraordinary successful ecosystem have actually come to being. And I think it's particularly interesting to read Steve Blank's account for the secret history of Silicon Valley, and how this ecosystem originally was actually driven by purchasing from Department of Defense. And that happened long before this was Silicon Valley. It was Tube Valley. Right? It was radio tubes, with high frequency equipment, many small companies that competed for contracts. And that actually shaped that enormously successful ecosystem that we today know as Silicon Valley. So the whole situation there with capital that came in, private capital that maybe came in first in the 1960s and 70s. It today has all these, the 5 components of the what's that, the pentahelix, then, right? It's a pentahelix, right? Yeah. So in Sweden, we have something of a parallel, actually. And particularly one of our primes, the Saab company, we all know about that. I myself born and grown up in Linköping. That's the headquarters of Saab, and that's where the fighter jets are being produced. So if we go back to the early 1960s, when Saab was designing the Viggen Saab 37 fighter jet, they needed computing power. That they said, we can't buy this computing power. So they developed it themselves, the computing power. It led to a spin-off company called Datasaab that in the late 1960s and early 70s produced the best mainframe computers in the world, the D21 and the D22. My mother was installing those computers for Citibank in New York in the early 1970s. Now, Saab was and has always been a very strong innovation company, but not a very strong sales company. So they couldn't maintain the Datasaab within their own company. Datasaab ended up with Ericsson. So at Ericsson, the competence from Datasaab was one of the very important components for Ericsson's journey to become a world-leading company in digitally based telecommunications. So my point here is not really to glorify what was called the the military-industrial complex in the 1970s. But it's to show that defense needs have historically played a very important role in creating long-term innovation capacity. And so today, when we're back into a situation which in many ways remind of the Cold War situation. So the question is, okay, how do we organize ourselves now? And is it just, I mean, we could dream of the open innovation system as much as we can or will, but we're not there, and we're a small country. So how do we actually position ourselves as well as possible within this new world? So I think very important now is to recognize that there are certain critical technologies, certain deep tech technologies that we need to focus on. So, and that's an interest from the Swedish government, from the Swedish defense and the European defense actors or jointly. So, and this is happening, of course, all over the world since 10 years and back to 15 years even. I've just been involved in a study with the European Commission to look at how dual-use research and innovation has been promoted in different parts of the world. It's a report, it's come to be released any of these days. It's called Unlocking the Potential of Dual-Use Research and Innovation, of course, something that the EU need to do much better than it has done before. But what we see there is it's that this is really happening, and we need to do it ourselves. But we need to do it in a way that is as open as possible. But the openness need to be limited to maybe you have to do your due diligence, whom to work with and whom not to work with. At the same time, the focus, the urgency that you presented from Ukraine is something that we should learn from. Okay, how could we create that ecosystems that could accelerate innovation under the circumstances where we, as our Prime Minister say, we're not at war, but it's also not peace. We actually live in some kind of twilight zone as it is. So how do we focus innovation in a way that it could develop something that is not only defense capabilities, but it is both defense and competitiveness and continued international cooperation. So that is something that we're struggling with ourselves at Vinnova, jointly with the armed forces. We have a joint innovation program for civil-military synergies, where it's a government assignment with a triple goal of creating defense capabilities, competitiveness, and international cooperation. So, conclude, the world that we discuss here today is not the world that we chose, but it's a world that we need to navigate, and that will require strategic mindset that combines openness, as you stressed, Chiara, but robustness, focus on excellence in key areas, keen foresight about what's happening, adopt so that we could adopt, and to create innovation ecosystems that is driven also by values. Thanks a lot.
Thank you very much. So, of course, having had two discussants, I need to offer the chance to Fiona to reply or to comment on the comments if she so prefers. I stole it, so.
Oh, you stole it. Okay, I thought I lost it. I mean, I'm very curious to hear from other people, so I don't want to take up too much time, except first, Chiara, to say thank you. I really appreciate it. And Carl, I also appreciate your comments. And I think both of them resonate of the kind of the academic, intellectual kind of community that you're describing. And I think, Carl, the the kind of sort of deep and complex questions that as a policymaker and allocator of resources. And it feels to me, I think, Chiara, you said something, you said it's this world between the sort of shared global good and the strategic national asset. And I think that's exactly the needle that governments are trying to thread, is exactly the way you describe it. And I think the layer that you added is something that I've spent a lot of time sort of thinking about, which is dual use technologies in particular, which also raises another set of tensions for our universities and institutions, because that's not something that they've necessarily always been quite as fond of in recent years. So I appreciate, I imagine, many of the conversations that sit behind, and Chiara, really appreciate your very thought-provoking remarks. So thank you.
Let's take a question if you want to.
Of course. Yes.
Thank you very much. Elena Angelis from Stockholm School of Economics and a research lab in Brussels FE Center. I would appreciate your views on the role of citizens in the helix, because they were not explicitly there.
Mm-hmm.
But when you started telling the story of drones, I remembered as a proud Lithuanian how over 3 days we raised 5 million euros for the drone. And over the 3 campaigns over the last 3 years, we raised, and I'm emotional, more than 22 million euros. So people brought money to buy technology. Plus, citizens have a political power in elections to basically change everything you have presented here. So what's your view on the role of citizens in the helix?
I mean, so the way I think about it, and I think, so first, thank you. And I think you're describing, I think, that sense of urgency that many, particularly, you know, the further east we travel, the more that becomes a very profound sense of urgency, particularly, you know, in February 22. I think of the organizations in that sort of pentahelix, that seems like a good word, as being inhabited by people. And of course, governments being shaped by citizens, likewise corporations, the pressure and the community. I mean, we've sort of wrestled in that model with sort of, I think our working assumption is that that sits on a bedrock of the humans and the citizens who have agency in a variety of different ways on those different organizations. When I think even about risk capital, you know, I would include in that both those formal organizations, but also crowdfunding of the kind that you described. And one of the very interesting things about Ukraine has been the huge role of philanthropy, both sort of domestic and international, the different kinds of crowdfunding and so on. And so I think that is absolutely profoundly important. I probably have yet to find the most optimal way. I feel very uncomfortable in sort of just putting people as a sort of its own stakeholder, because they infuse the whole thing. But I think there's something about the way that we talk about it and understand it that has to take your point extremely seriously. And we perhaps haven't quite landed that. Yeah. So thank you. Appreciate it. Go ahead.
Thank you, Jon Simonsen at the Swedish Prime Minister's Office. I have a question regarding openness versus speed. And as I understand, in Ukraine is approximately 6 months ahead of Russia when it comes to speed of deploying new drone technology. I don't know if it's true.
They hope so.
They hope so. So how does openness and speed interrelate? Because in my sense, Ukraine works very much focused on speed and not so much maybe on protecting openness.
So I would say that they absolutely are not protecting openness. In fact, quite the opposite. I think that, and it is a tension. I mean, I think there's I'm not actually arguing that we should be either more open or less. I actually think it's an important question for us to wrestle with, particularly when it comes to sort of how we develop the long-term scientific foundations, but how ecosystems are built on top of that. So I don't actually, I think it's quite it's quite complex. In Ukraine, of course, you want to be ahead. And so what that really is all about is generating intellectual property in the sort of tacit sense of designs. But when your drones get shot down, then the other side effectively reverse engineers them, and then they copy them. On the other hand, openness to new ideas that are coming in from the outside of Ukraine, from allies, is extremely important. So I think there is a tension in that. And I think with any of the dual use technologies, we also see that. Right? We see this with all the work that's been going on in engineering biology, for example, right, which I think causes us all, right, the tremendous openness of the underlying scientific community has got us to a point where we then worry about how to control the potential unintended consequences. And so I don't think it's, we have, I mean, putting the dial all the way to openness is actually not where my sort of policy self would come out on this, but I think it really raises this important set of trade-offs. Oh, yeah.
Yeah, just a very short commentary. I don't think it's necessarily about openness or open or closed. It's about how do you go from open to something that is closed, where you can actually be really, really quick in a closed system, much quicker than in an open system. So it's not either or, it's how do we connect the two sides.
And maybe about what the boundaries are, right? So that's probably the most important question, is who open to whom? There was a
Final question here.
Oh, sorry, I look this way. All right, can we do both? Is that allowed?
It is certainly allowed. We are careful to close this and running for our online audience, but if you have time for 3 more minutes,
We'll do.
would I be too? Two more minutes.
Okay, quick question. Caroline Häusler, Innovation Policy Advisor of the German government. I have a question in terms of ecosystems. You start out to define it as dense, open communities, and regional proximity is important. But now we talk a lot about European ecosystem. We have the IPCEs and so on. And the question is like the boundaries, how still
Sure.
the role of geographical proximity.
Why don't we do both questions, and then I'll see if I can answer both at once.
Cheers. Thank you. My name is Ulf Kruse. I run a C-level business network. A question regarding openness. Your picture there on the drone, where the ideas come from, the technology come from, and where they're manufactured, there is nothing coming from China when it comes to technology, actually, at that time, right? And I just look at number of billion-dollar companies in the world, and there are 111 in Sweden and about the same amount in Switzerland, and which is together, it's the same amount as a total number of billion-dollar companies in China. So a question of, have you looked at democracies versus non-democracies when it comes to level of innovation?
So on that last point, no. I mean, I think people have, but I also think that we have to be a little careful with how we understand and interpret the data that's coming from China, because I just think things are measured in different ways. And if you look at even if you look at intellectual property, for example, and patents and things, you see this enormous increase in that. And I think it's quite highly concentrated in particular areas. I mean, the very recent IPO of CATL, the battery company, will tell us something about at least the particular areas of expertise and so on. So I mean, I think there's a view, and I think we'd like it to be true, that democracies are better at innovation. I'm not actually sure that the evidence bears that out, but I would hope that others would perhaps know more about the actual data on that than I do. I think when it comes, you're exactly right. So there is a sort of complexity. The way I try to think about it is that if ecosystems are these places with very dense interconnectivity, that what we're really talking about, so that conversation, they're really at a regional level, right? They get nested in the sort of national level, that conversation that's connected up to a sort of European level. And I think what we're really talking about is a sort of division of innovative labor across specific places in different countries. And so we're trying to kind of fit what is actually an innovation phenomenon that is pretty regional in its construct, with a national level discussion about sovereignty, with a European level conversation about sovereignty. And so I think your question is exactly, you present that exactly right. And I'm not sure we've worked out quite what we mean, except that it gets played out at sort of Europe level conversations and alliances, but the actual work is getting done still, I believe, in these very dense locations, and trying to navigate our way through that in a way that allows for the most productive sort of innovation to get the solutions that we need. I don't think we've either got the language or the constructs yet to really deal with that properly. That's really good, thought-provoking. Thank you. The microphone. Oh, sorry.
So it may not be the world we choose to live in, but it's one we have to navigate. As Carl was saying, we need to do that together. We need to do it in dialogue. So thank you very much to all who made this possible. Thanks to Stockholm School of Economics, Valentina Tartari, for hosting the event today. Thanks to our discussant, Carl and Chiara, and thanks to our speaker, Professor Fiona Murray. Thanks to all of you for following us online and for being here with us today. For those of you who are here today, there's going to be a light snack served just outside to keep the conversations flowing. Thank you.